When people think of German tanks in World War II, it is often the massive Tiger or the sleek Panther that comes to mind. But the real backbone of Hitler's armored divisions was something far more common and far more deadly for the men inside it: the Panzer IV. To the world, Nazi propaganda portrayed it as an invincible spearhead, a knight in steel. But to the young crews who climbed inside, it was often nothing more than a coffin waiting to burn. Imagine being 19 years old, told you were chosen for greatness, only to discover that your destiny was to suffocate in smoke and fire. This is not a story of glory. It is the story of fear, exhaustion, and death inside the Panzer IV. From the very beginning, the Panzer IV was everywhere. More than 8,500 of these tanks rolled off the production lines between 1937 and 1945. They fought from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen plains of Russia, from the invasion of Poland to the final defense of Berlin. For the German army, the Panzer IV was essential. For its crews, it was unavoidable. Most young tankers would never serve in the mighty Tiger or the elite Panther. Their fate was tied to this machine. And that fate was brutal. The Panzer IV began as a support tank, carrying a short-barreled 75mm gun. At first, it performed well enough against lightly armored enemies. But war changes quickly. By 1941, when German troops clashed with Soviet T-34s and KV-1s, the Panzer IV was outclassed. Its shells bounced harmlessly, while Soviet fire tore through. Upgrades would follow, but with each new layer of armor and each heavier weapon, the strain on the machine grew worse. For the men inside, every battle was a gamble. The story of the Panzer IV begins long before the horrors of the Eastern Front or the rubble of Berlin. In the mid-1930s, Germany was rearming in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. The architects of Hitler's war machine wanted a tank that could support infantry, destroy bunkers, and move quickly with advancing troops. The Panzer IV was never meant to be the star of armored warfare. It was designed as a medium support tank, armed with a short-barreled 75mm gun, capable of firing high-explosive shells to shatter defenses. When the first Panzer IVs rolled into action during the invasion of Poland in September 1939, they seemed effective enough. Against lightly armored Polish and later French vehicles, their gun could do the job. The tank's role was to follow infantry, provide covering fire, and break through weak spots in enemy lines. In France, during the spring of 1940, Panzer IVs helped smash through defenses at Sedan and across the Meuse River. They were not invincible, but they were reliable, and for a time that was enough. But war is never static. By June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. It was here that the Panzer IV faced its greatest trial. Soviet engineers had fielded tanks unlike anything the Germans expected. The T-34, with its sloped armor, and the massive KV-1, with thick protection and powerful guns, shocked German tank crews. Suddenly, the shells of the Panzer IV bounced harmlessly off enemy armor, while Soviet rounds smashed through German steel. Letters and reports from that summer described the fear. German tankers, trained to believe in their superiority, were horrified to see their weapons fail. Entire formations were shredded as Soviet counterattacks rolled forward with armored waves the Germans could not easily stop. The myth of German invincibility cracked on the steppes of Russia. For the men inside the Panzer IV, it was a revelation that survival was never guaranteed. The German response was desperate but determined. By 1942, the Panzer IV had been rearmed with the long-barreled 75mm KWK-40 gun. At last, the tank could pierce the T-34 at range. Armor was thickened, tracks widened, the silhouette slightly modified. For a time, this gave German crews a fighting chance again. On the battlefield, the improved Panzer IV could duel with Soviet mediums and even hold its own. Yet upgrades always came with a cost. The heavier gun and thicker armor pushed the tank's engine, transmission, and suspension beyond their original limits. Breakdowns grew common. Mechanics worked endlessly to keep vehicles moving, But the Panzer IV was already straining against the weight of its own evolution. Crews often spent as much time repairing as they did fighting. On the vast expanses of Russia, a broken-down tank was a death sentence if spotted by enemy aircraft or artillery. Still, the Panzer IV remained essential. Germany simply could not build enough Tigers or Panthers to equip its armies. The Tiger was powerful but expensive, and slow to produce. The Panther was advanced, but plagued with mechanical problems in its early versions. The Panzer IV, by contrast, could be built in large numbers, and it filled the ranks of armored divisions from Africa to the Eastern Front. In North Africa, under the blazing desert sun, Panzer IVs fought against British Crusaders, Grants, and eventually the American Sherman. Their long-barreled gun proved effective against Allied armor, but heat and sand worked against them. Engines overheated, filters clogged, and crews fought in stifling conditions. Survivors remembered stripping down to undershirts, sweat dripping in the suffocating compartments, while they battled in an environment that punished both man and machine. On the Eastern Front, conditions were the opposite, but no less brutal. Bitter winters froze oil solid in engines. Crews kept tanks idling overnight, burning precious fuel just to ensure they could move in the morning. Men curled under tarps beside their machines, shivering through the night, always listening for the distant rumble of Soviet artillery. When combat came, it was often sudden and devastating. A Panzer IV caught by surprise might be lost in seconds, its crew scrambling for life in the snow and fire. By the middle of the war, the Panzer IV had become the most common tank in Germany's arsenal. More than 8,500 were produced between 1937 and 1945. If you were a German tanker, odds were you would fight and perhaps die in a Panzer IV rather than in the mighty Tiger or the sleek Panther. For the men inside, the tank was both their shield and their prison. It could save them, but more often, it doomed them. This is the paradox of the Panzer IV. It was Germany's workhorse, always present, always essential. But for the young men forced into its steel shell, it was also the machine that bound them to a war they could never win. By the summer of 1943, the Panzer IV reached its peak of both strength and vulnerability. The most decisive moment came at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. German armored divisions, spearheaded by hundreds of Panzer IVs, charged into a wall of Soviet defenses. Trenches, minefields, and countless anti-tank guns awaited them. Within the first 2 weeks, more than 100 Panzer IVs were destroyed. Survivors recalled a landscape of burning hulks, black smoke rising into the sky, and the screams of men trapped in machines that had become furnaces. For the crews, Kursk proved that no matter how much their tanks were upgraded, they were still prey to overwhelming firepower. From that point forward, the tide of war turned irreversibly. On the Eastern Front, Soviet industry churned out T-34s in staggering numbers, while new heavy tanks like the IS-2, with its massive 122mm gun, made even the improved Panzer IV look obsolete. German crews had to adapt. They were told to rely on ambush tactics, to strike from concealment in forests or villages, to shoot first and retreat before Soviet reinforcements arrived. Yet these strategies could only delay defeat. Every battle felt like rolling dice with death. The Western Front offered no relief. When Allied forces stormed Normandy in June 1944, the Panzer IV was once again at the center of the fight. German tankers faced not only the American Sherman, but also the British Sherman Firefly, whose 17-pounder gun could pierce a Panzer IV from long range. In the hedgerows of France, many German tanks never even had the chance to fire before being blown apart. Worse still, the skies belonged entirely to the Allies. Fighter bombers like the British Typhoon and the American P-47 Thunderbolt prowled overhead, launching rockets and dropping bombs with terrifying precision. German crews gave these planes a nickname, Jabos, short for fighter bombers, tankers. The sound of engines above was more terrifying than the sight of enemy armor ahead. Inside the Panzer IV, the reality of combat was far removed from the propaganda that had lured so many young men into uniform. The fighting compartment was small, crowded with 5 men pressed shoulder to shoulder. The gunner strained to see through narrow optics. The loader lifted heavy shells again and again, often until his arms shook with exhaustion. The driver fought stiff controls, while the commander tried to shout orders over the deafening roar of the Maybach engine. Communication was a battle in itself. Smoke from the gun and fumes from the engine filled the air. After hours inside, men emerged half-deaf, their throats raw, their eyes burning. Worse than the discomfort was the ever-present fear. A hit to the ammunition rack could turn the tank into a fireball in seconds. Survivors described having no more than 10 or 15 seconds to escape before the entire vehicle exploded. The terror of fire haunted every crewman. Many carried pistols not for the enemy, but for themselves in case they were trapped in a burning hull. Allied soldiers had a grim nickname for tanks: coffins on wheels. For Panzer IV crews, it was a cruel truth they lived with every day. By late 1944, casualty rates among tank crews had grown catastrophic. Few survived long enough to become veterans. Replacements were often boys from the Hitler Youth, barely trained, thrown into battle after only a few weeks. These teenagers climbed into the same steel shells that had already consumed thousands of lives. Many never came back. Survivors remembered the horror of seeing comrades reduced to ash, or the anguish of abandoning crippled tanks under fire, leaving friends behind because there was no time to drag them out. Discipline within the German army made the nightmare worse. Orders to hold positions to the last man were routine, even when ammunition was gone and tanks surrounded. Crews who abandoned vehicles without authorization risked being branded deserters, a crime punishable by death. More than 15,000 German soldiers were executed during the war for desertion, and panzer crews were not spared. Reports tell of men shot by their own officers for retreating or dragged before courts-martial that handed down death sentences within hours. For young tankers, survival meant choosing between certain death at enemy hands or possible execution from their own side. As the war dragged on, the Panzer IV became a double-edged sword. It was everywhere, and its gun could still be deadly in skilled hands. But every battle stacked the odds against the men inside. Soviet waves, Allied artillery barrages, endless air attacks, and the crushing weight of Nazi discipline created a world where hope vanished quickly. By the end of 1944, most crews understood the truth. The Panzer IV was no longer a weapon of victory. It was a mobile coffin. Each time they closed the hatch, they wondered if they would ever open it again. By the final year of the war, the story of the Panzer IV had become one of slow collapse. The machine that once spearheaded Blitzkrieg was now hopelessly outdated. Crews fought not with the confidence of conquerors, but with the desperation of survivors. On the Eastern Front, the nightmare was relentless. The vast plains of Russia swallowed entire divisions. Summers coated everything in choking dust. Autumn rains turned roads into oceans of mud. Winters froze oil in engines and numbed hands that were expected to load shells. Tankers often kept their engines running through the night to prevent them from freezing, burning scarce fuel, just to survive until morning. They slept in damp uniforms beneath tarps, shivering as Soviet artillery rumbled in the distance. Combat here was ceaseless. Soviet armies attacked in waves, hurling tanks, infantry, and anti-tank guns at German lines. At Kursk, Panzer IVs had already been chewed apart in minefields and kill zones. Later battles brought no relief. The Red Army learned to exploit the Panzer IV's weaknesses, striking from the flanks where armor was thinnest. Infantry ambushes became a constant terror. Molotov cocktails burst into flames on engine decks. Grenades were shoved under treads. Anti-tank rifles punched through side plates. Even if crews managed to escape a destroyed tank, they were often gunned down in the snowfields by small arms or bayonets. Surrender was rarely an option. Nazi propaganda warned that capture by the Soviets meant torture or worse. Many tankers believed it. Discipline was merciless. Orders to fight to the last man, enforced by roving squads of SS troops, left crews with no safe path to survival. Some men carried pistols with a single bullet, not for combat, but to escape a fiery death. Between Soviet shells, their own officers' threats, and the propaganda that painted surrender as treachery, panzer crews were trapped in a psychological prison as much as in a steel one. On the Western Front, the dangers were different but just as deadly. After Normandy in 1944, German tankers faced overwhelming Allied firepower. American and British artillery barrages blanketed entire fields. Even if a Panzer IV survived, its crew might be killed or maimed by shrapnel tearing through thin armor plates. In cities like Villers-Bocage, Panzer IVs fought in narrow streets only to be picked off by Sherman Fireflies waiting in ambush. For every Sherman destroyed, two more seemed to appear, backed by endless reinforcements. Worst of all was the sky. The Luftwaffe was no longer a shield. Fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Typhoon prowled above, launching rockets and dropping bombs. German crews dreaded the sound of engines overhead. They nicknamed these planes Jabos, and to them, the whine of aircraft meant almost certain death. One survivor later said, "The Jabos were worse than the tanks. At least against a tank you could fire back." By late 1944, shortages made everything harder. Fuel was scarce. Spare parts nearly vanished. Many Panzer IVs went into battle with just enough gasoline for a few hours of fighting. If they survived that long, they often became immobile targets, abandoned or destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. Others were simply left behind on muddy roads when their engines failed. For tankers, the line between machine and grave grew thinner with each month. The human toll was staggering. Fresh recruits filled the hatches as veterans were killed. Many were teenagers from the Hitler Youth, boys barely out of school, indoctrinated to believe they were destined for greatness. Instead, they climbed into machines that killed them within weeks. Survivors remembered the haunting sight of wide-eyed boys stepping into tanks with pride, only to vanish in smoke and fire days later. As Germany collapsed, the Panzer IV was thrown into hopeless battles. In Hungary, in the Ardennes, in the ruins of Berlin, they rolled forward not as engines of victory, but as sacrifices to delay the inevitable. Commanders still demanded obedience. Crews who considered abandoning their vehicles risked execution from their own side. Loyalty to comrades kept many fighting when logic told them to run. To leave a tank was to leave behind brothers who had shared fear, exhaustion, and trauma inside a steel shell. When the end finally came in May 1945, it was abrupt. One day, tankers were still fighting. The next, orders arrived to cease fire. Survivors described the silence that followed, an eerie emptiness after years of ceaseless battle. Relief was mixed with grief, relief for still being alive, grief for countless friends who had been incinerated, buried, or simply disappeared. For those who surrendered to the Western Allies, captivity often meant survival, though many struggled with lifelong trauma. For those captured by the Soviets, years in brutal labor camps awaited. And for many who never left their Panzer IVs, the battlefields of Europe became their final resting place. The legacy of the Panzer IV is not one of glory. It is a story of human suffering. The men who fought inside were not invincible knights of a mechanized age. They were young, frightened, and trapped in machines that could betray them at any moment. The truth behind the myth is simple. The Panzer IV was everywhere, but for its crews, it was less a weapon of triumph than a sentence to an early grave. The story of the Panzer IV and its crews does not end with medals, parades, or glory. It ends with silence on the battlefields of Europe, where the wrecks of burned-out tanks still stood long after the fighting stopped. These were not invincible knights of steel, as Nazi propaganda once proclaimed. They were sons, brothers, and fathers, trapped in machines that often became their graves. From Poland in 1939 to Berlin in 1945, the Panzer IV was always there. More than 8,500 were built, and nearly all were consumed in the fires of battle. For the men inside, survival was never promised. Their lives were measured not in years, but in battles. Many lasted only weeks. Few became veterans. Those who did carried scars that never healed. As we reflect on World War II, it is tempting to focus on the grand strategies, the famous battles, and the names of leaders. But behind every machine, there were human beings who lived with fear, exhaustion, and despair. The Panzer IV crews remind us that war is not only about nations clashing. It is about individuals caught in forces larger than themselves, forced to fight for a cause that gave them nothing in return. World War II was the bloodiest conflict in history, and its lessons remain urgent today. The Panzer IV shows us the terrible cost of blind obedience, propaganda, and endless war. It shows us how quickly the dreams of youth can be consumed by fire. It shows us how a machine, meant to protect, can become a coffin instead. The ruins of that war still whisper a warning. Every burned tank, every shattered street, every grave reminds us that the price of violence is always higher than promised. And so, when we remember World War II, we must remember not only the victories, but also the losses, the countless young men who never had the chance to grow old. Their story is not one of triumph, but of sacrifice. May their suffering remind us to fight for justice, for independence, for freedom, and above all, for peace.